ENCA gives a variety of different newsmakers the chance to host this program, unfiltered, accountable, and accessible. Corruption has been the defining characteristic of our political landscape for the greater part of our democratic dispensation. Several national shutdown protests later, and corruption still breathes throughout the apparatus of our state. Corruption cost the state at least 27 billion annually, as well as the loss of 76,000 jobs that would otherwise have been created. And now, Western Cape Premier Helen Zille has suggested that South Africans protest against corruption by withholding their taxes. A tax revolt, which is what she's suggesting, is a clear criminal offense in the South African law. But the question I ask tonight is whether a tax revolt is a morally acceptable and effective tool in our political toolbox as a means to protest against a relentlessly corrupt government machinery. You can be part of the conversation. Here's how.
Tweet us at ENCA using the hashtag LHIO. Call us on 011-759-6340 or send us a WhatsApp or WhatsApp video on 082-884-6370. And make sure those videos are no longer than 30 seconds, please.
I'm joined now in studio by Economist Xhanti Payi, as well as political commentator Kanthan Pillay. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. I want to start with you, Xhanti. 57 billion rand gap in our fiscus just this year alone. How much further would a tax revolt take that?
Well, I mean, I think it's very difficult to say, right? In the first instance, in South Africa, the way we pay tax is very different to the way we pay to people in the US pay taxes. So your employer actually deducts it before you actually have it. So there's no way in which you can actually say, I'm not paying, unless we found some way to stop employers themselves from paying on our behalf, which would be a very difficult exercise. I think that's one thing.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, mechanistically, this is a very difficult thing to do. But if South African politics has taught us anything, is that it's not impossible.
Yeah, definitely not. And of course, the second thing would be actually if we were to take out our taxes, which is of course the mainstay of how the government works, in which actually not just the ways in which we pay for roads and clinics, but how we show social solidarity to those who are less able than the rest of us. So, for example, how we pay housing, how we pay for housing for the poor, how we pay grants. So they would literally go hungry tomorrow if we start paying our taxes. I'm not so sure that that's
Many people then ask if it's the case that paying taxes is us contributing to the social welfare of the country. If we keep bleeding 30 billion rand a year through corruption, then money is not actually really going to the social welfare of the country. Surely then this is morally acceptable by some means to just withhold.
Well, I think that's a spurious argument in the sense that actually we haven't missed a payment in social grants. I have not heard anybody who's saying, well, we've actually missed payments because of corruption. Now, there's a way in which, of course, people siphon out of how those grants are paid. As we know, for example, what had been going on in those through processes through SASSA, where people find ways in which they steal around the ways in which they are paid. There's one thing of how people are stealing through providing those social services. It's quite another, actually, to make sure that they don't actually get paid to begin with. And I think there are obviously multiple moral obligations in the way in which, of course, we think about even how we pay and how those people spend that money. Remember, our economic system is such that everything is connected. So the grants we pay actually also finance our job system because those people go out and pay.
Let's talk about grants.
Things.
You know, millions of South Africans depend on a grant system, for instance. We heard the numbers when SASSA was going through its turbulence. If there's no money to pay grants, for instance, people could literally die. And Kanthan, you are of the belief that this is a viable means of protest. What do you make of the people who would die?
That's an interesting take on it, because I don't remember actually expressing that view at any point. I think ultimately what I was trying to say is that you have to end up with a sort of sense of balance in terms of whether the money that you are contributing to the government, to the fiscus, is in fact the most effective way of benefiting society at large. So if you take a view that I think all of us as South Africans have an interest in the country moving forward, and all of us actually have an interest in the well-being of the masses. But the problem is right now that our tax money, which is meant to benefit the masses, which is meant to go into those social grant structures, which is meant to go into healthcare, which is meant to go into all of these things that grow the nation, have in fact been going into Louis Vuitton bags and ending up on planes in Dubai. So the question
Surely you can be a little bit more generous than that, because it's certainly not a factual claim to make that all our money has been going to
well,
corruption.
if you take into account the fact that at the end of the, let's just go back a couple of years to the Mbeki era. We had the single biggest sustained period of economic growth in the country's history. Even at the height of the apartheid era, they were never able to achieve that type of growth. And what we had during the Mbeki era was the benefit that came out of that economic growth. The money that we saved from not paying interest was taken and used to pay social grants. And the knock-on effect on actually improving the lives of people in this country was huge. It was massive.
Is it your claim that corruption started after the Mbeki era?
I'm saying that after the Mbeki era, what happened was that under the Zuma administration, we began to borrow money once again. So during the Mbeki era, we had paid off the national debt. Now, under the Zuma administration, we began to borrow, and we began to borrow massive amounts of money. So the national debt, Kanthan, help me out here, it's 2.75
Our debt to
trillion?
GDP
Yes.
ratio is sitting at closer to 60%. It's flirting with the 60% margin at the moment.
But looking in absolute terms, I understand the numbers are close to 3 trillion rand in terms of what we are actually owing. So if you take that view, that this is money that we didn't need to spend, because it was money that was borrowed by the Zuma administration and ostensibly meant to be put into projects, but didn't actually go for that purpose. And now we, as a nation, suddenly have an obligation to pay off that debt, and it's debt that was incurred that didn't actually benefit people.
I think it's a bit unfair to stir up the idea that the money was borrowed to finance corruption, when in actual fact, the money was borrowed to finance an RDP project. The money was borrowed to finance a national development plan, and it's continuously doing so. We now have free tertiary education, at least a phasing in thereof. Money needs to be borrowed for that. So money was borrowed for genuine and real things. So to some degree, we can't blame corruption for us borrowing money and being at the
You're
mercy
quite right.
of
I think we can actually, in some point. I think, look, to be fair, part of the reason why we are accumulating debt at the rate we are and actually struggling now to probably pay it back is because a lot of the money has leaked out of the system. Remember, in any government system, what we always borrow in order to actually pay for something. But we will always have all this money that's lost. I mean, every year, I think the numbers we're quoting comes from the Auditor General, who keeps telling us we're losing more money in terms of unplanned spending. Because we plan to spend, and then we spend on something else, by which we mean the money leaks out of the system. But what the difficulty is, I think, with asking for voters or taxpayers to not pay is exactly what is a government shutdown. And that's not useful. If it's not useful in the United States, it's not going to be useful in South
I want us
Africa.
to touch on that. I want us to touch on that, but we have to pay some bills quickly. We continue the conversation after the break. Make sure to use the hashtag LHIO on social media to engage.